Actually, one of the questions, so Masood, thank you, asking about the consent model, and as we move to a broader open finance ecosystem, what does that mean for the consent model? And if I may abuse the privilege, I'll perhaps build on that a little bit and say, and also ask, what do we think this also means for the strong customer authentication model? Because here we're looking at, I think, a scenario where there's potentially giving consent to access to more things. So how do we evolve the consent model? But also many providers in the open finance space don't necessarily have the level of engagement or an app that has strong customer authentication built in the way that a mobile banking app does. For example, I don't have a pension app that I go and look at my pension. So I guess there's a question here around what do we think it means for how we evolve the consent model so it can capture more use cases? But actually, what do we think this means for the authentication model? Is this the moment that is really crying out for a federated bank ID model? So that SCA experience we're used to with our banks can be used more broadly. I realize there's a couple of elements to that. So I'll perhaps open it to the panel for whoever's got the fastest and strongest point of view. Looks like Sam's waving.
Well, can I just say, just from a consumer perspective, before perhaps some of the other areas of the panel kind of chip in on actually what the answer is, but can I just give a consumer view? Because we, obviously with Moneyhub, have been servicing a group of consumers that have been screen scraping until recently. So we had to migrate them over to open banking. And I don't know how many people in this kind of webinar would be shocked to hear that we've had quite a few requests from our consumers to go back to screen scraping. And the reason they want to go back is not because that they're upset about the link and the direct link that the open banking API gives them, but because basically they don't like the multi-factor authentication with some of the scenarios that are in place, and they don't want to have to reauthorize every 3 months. They're like, well, I didn't have to do that before, and I've been doing this for years, and I'm all happy. And so when you explain to them, well, A, it's illegal, so you can't screen scrape anymore. So you're not going to do that. We've got to do open banking. That's all there is to it, and it's much better, and all the rest. You can tell that then they're not 100% convinced. So I'd just like to put the consumer in the ring here and say that the consumers, once their trust is there and they're comfortable with who they're sharing or consenting to give that data to, that they're really wanting the convenience factor to kick in then. So I think we have got to crack that. And on my pension dashboard mode, one of the things I did say to them is if you use that government ID to get into the pension dashboard, then there's no point any of us doing a pension dashboard because no one's going to get in. So forget that. So we've got to find, and I'm not the person to do that, but I'm sure there are people in this panel that can do that. But do not set something up that creates such a high barrier for security that means that just no one can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And you mentioned trust there as well. So I guess part of the question here is there more we need to do building on open banking to help drive more consumer confidence and trust in usage of these services as open finance extends? What do we think? Stephen, Brad, Kevin, Shefali, I'd be really interested in your views.
In terms of the consent mechanisms, again, from a consumer point of view, you really can't have them differentiate between open banking and open finance, because for a end user, they may not be aware that, for example, if you bank with Barclays, you also invest in Barclays Smart Investor, two different systems, but as far as they're concerned, that's one provider. They don't want to have two different methods for logging on. So it is an important thing. And perhaps a bank ID has a place to play, but I think there's a lot of issues around that. It's almost like a separate topic, in terms of would such an ID go as far as KYC and liability issues around that sort of stuff, which is bigger topic.
Yeah, cheers, Brad. Shefali, please.
I was just going to say, I'll be very quick because I know we're nearly out of time. I was going to say two things. I think the first is to look at the psychology of the end user. And so to the point of building trust, one must also say, well, if they've understood to give consent in the first instance, then they've really understood why they're giving consent. And so we kind of lean and trust with them in terms of what they want to do. The second point to make is I don't think as an industry we did a really terrific job about educating the consumer and the end user about open banking. And so what did that mean to reconsent? What did that mean to say, okay, after 90 days, this is why you have to re-authenticate and go through that whole authentication flow? Because it is regulated, it is mandated, governments did it for our benefit. The European Union wrote PSD2 for exactly that same reason, from a GDPR perspective as well. It's really to protect the consumer. And so I think it's not the element of going it and throwing it away or just saying, look, they might not want it and let's just abrogate it, but making it frictionless, making it seamless. And for us as an industry to really make submissions to governments and to regulators to say, there's actually a better way to do this. It starts with understanding the consumer's needs and understanding what they want, and then using technology to build that bridge to say, this is how we do it. And this is how we do it well, so that it's frictionless, that the user experience is beautiful, and that ultimately that trust is maintained between the application, the intermediary, and the end user.
Yeah, thanks, Shefali. No, I agree. Kevin, any additional points that that you wanted to add?
I think just running off Shefali, I think that if you start with the customer value and what you're going to be creating, communicating, educating, making them aware of the new products and services, what value it delivers, that'll drive demand. But we need to keep researching into this. It's very early days. We need to keep an eye on the API conformance and standards, what impact it's having on competition and innovation, what impact it's having on vulnerable customers and inclusion. What's the level of trust is up? Does a customer really understand open banking? Really? If you saw anybody in the street, does it matter if the product and service is trusted and used and delivering value for them? But we need to look at what impact open finance will bring around key people in society, like vulnerable financial well-being, pension deficit, savings problem.
And Stephen, I don't know whether you've got any final comments before we wrap up, because we're sort of approaching the end now.
I agree from the comments around designing it from the point of the consumer point of view and having some consistency around how you do consent and authentication and security across open finance. I think the challenge is people say you can just build a technology solution that's easy. I think the last 3 years have proven that it's quite complex and quite difficult, especially when you see the range of firms involved in open finance and the various kind of histories and legacy of their architecture and what systems they can perform and support. So I think that does need to be thought about quite carefully, how you come up with something that's actually workable on both sides.